Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 1. Murder and Pillage. Hauptmann Fritz Schneider trudged wearily through the somber aisles of the dark forest. Sweat rolled down his bullet head and stood upon his heavy jowls and bull neck. His lieutenant marched beside him while Under-Lieutenant von Goss brought up the rear, following with a handful of askaris the tired and all but exhausted porters whom the black soldiers, following the example of their white officer, encouraged with the sharp points of bayonets and the metal-shod butts of rifles. There were no porters within reach of Hauptmann Schneider, so he vented his Prussian spleen upon the askaris nearest at hand, yet with greater circumspection, since these men bore loaded rifles and the three white men were alone with them in the heart of Africa. Ahead of the Hauptmann marched half his company, behind him the other half. Thus were the dangers of the savage jungle minimized for the German captain. At the forefront of the column staggered two naked savages fastened to each other by a neck chain. These were the native guides impressed into the service of Kultur, and upon their poor, bruised bodies Kultur's brand was revealed in divers cruel wounds and bruises. Thus, even in darkest Africa, was the light of German civilization commencing to reflect itself upon the undeserving natives, just as at the same period, the fall of 1914, it was shedding its glorious effulgence upon benighted Belgium. It is true that the guides had led the party astray, but this is the way of most African guides, nor did it matter that ignorance rather than evil intent had been the cause of their failure. It was enough for Hauptmann Fritz Schneider to know that he was lost in the African wilderness, and that he had at hand human beings less powerful than he who could be made to suffer by torture. That he did not kill them outright was partially due to a faint hope that they might eventually prove the means of extricating him from his difficulties, and partially that so long as they lived they might still be made to suffer. The poor creatures, hoping that chance might lead them at last upon the right trail, insisted that they knew the way, and so led on through a dismal forest along a winding game trail trodden deep by the feet of countless generations of the savage denizens of the jungle. Here Tantor, the elephant, took his long way from dust wallow to water. Here Buto, the rhinoceros, blundered blindly in his solitary majesty, while by night the great cats paced silently upon their padded feet beneath the dense canopy of overreaching trees toward the broad plain beyond, where they found their best hunting. It was at the edge of this plain, which came suddenly and unexpectedly before the eyes of the guides, that their sad hearts beat with renewed hope. Here the Hauptmann drew a deep sigh of relief. For after days of hopeless wandering through almost impenetrable jungle, the broad vista of waving grasses dotted here and there with open park-like woods, and in the far distance the winding line of green shrubbery that denoted a river, appeared to the European a veritable heaven. The Hun smiled in his relief, passed a cheery word with his lieutenant, and then scanned the broad plain with his field glasses. Back and forth they swept across the rolling land until at last they came to rest upon a point near the center of the landscape and close to the green-fringed contours of the river. "We are in luck," said Schneider to his companions. "Do you see it?" The lieutenant, who was also gazing through his own glasses, finally brought them to rest upon the same spot that had held the attention of his superior. "Yes," he said, "an English farm. It must be Greystokes, for there is none other in this part of British East Africa. God is with us, Herr Captain." "We have come upon the English Schweinhund long before he can have learned that his country is at war with ours," replied Schneider. "Let him be the first to feel the iron hand of Germany." "Let us hope that he is at home," said the lieutenant, "that we may take him with us when we report to Krat at Nairobi. It will go well indeed with Herr Hauptmann Fritz Schneider if he brings in the famous Tarzan of the Apes as a prisoner of war." Schneider smiled and puffed out his chest. "You are right, my friend," he said. "It will go well with both of us, but I shall have to travel far to catch General Kraut before he reaches Mombasa. These English pigs with their contemptible army will make good time to the Indian Ocean." It was in a better frame of mind that the small force set out across the open country toward the trim and well-kept farm buildings of John Clayton, Lord Greystoke, but disappointment was to be their lot, since neither Tarzan of the Apes nor his son was at home. Lady Jane, ignorant of the fact that a state of war existed between Great Britain and Germany, welcomed the officers most hospitably and gave orders through her trusted Waziri to prepare a feast for the black soldiers of the enemy. Far to the east, Tarzan of the Apes was traveling rapidly from Nairobi toward the farm. At Nairobi he had received news of the World War that had already started, and anticipating an immediate invasion of British East Africa by the Germans, was hurrying homeward to fetch his wife to a place of greater security. With him were a score of his ebon warriors, but far too slow for the ape-man was the progress of these trained and hardened woodsmen. When necessity demanded, Tarzan of the Apes sloughed the thin veneer of his civilization, and with it the hampering apparel that was its badge. In a moment the polished English gentleman reverted to the naked ape-man. His mate was in danger. For the time that single thought dominated. He did not think of her as Lady Jane Greystoke, but rather as the she he had won by the might of his steel thews, and that he must hold and protect by virtue of the same offensive armament. It was no member of the House of Lords who swung swiftly and grimly through the tangled forest or trod with untiring muscles the wide stretches of open plain. It was a great he-ape filled with a single purpose that excluded all thoughts of fatigue or danger. Little Manu the monkey, scolding and chattering in the upper terraces of the forest, saw him pass. Long had it been since he had thus beheld the great Tarmangani naked and alone hurtling through the jungle. Bearded and grey was Manu the monkey, and to his dim old eyes came the fire of recollection of those days when Tarzan of the Apes had ruled supreme, lord of the jungle, over all the myriad life that trod the matted vegetation between the boles of the great trees, or flew or swung or climbed in the leafy fastness upward to the very apex of the loftiest terraces. And Numa, the lion, lying up for the day close beside last night's successful kill, blinked his yellow-green eyes and twitched his tawny tail as he caught the scent spoor of his ancient enemy. Nor was Tarzan senseless to the presence of Numa or Manu or any of the many jungle beasts he passed in his rapid flight towards the west. No particle had his shallow probing of English society dulled his marvelous sense faculties. His nose had picked out the presence of Numa the lion, even before the majestic king of beasts was aware of his passing. He had heard noisy little Manu, and even the soft rustling of the parting shrubbery where Sheeta passed before either of these alert animals sensed his presence. But however keen the senses of the ape-man, however swift his progress through the wild country of his adoption, however mighty the muscles that bore him, he was still mortal. Time and space placed their inexorable limits upon him, nor was there another who realized this truth more keenly than Tarzan. He chafed and fretted that he could not travel with the swiftness of thought, and that the long, tedious miles stretching far ahead of him must require hours and hours of tireless effort upon his part before he would swing at last from the final bow of the fringing forest into the open plain and in sight of his goal. Days it took, even though he lay up at night for but a few hours and left to chance the finding of meat directly on his trail. If Wapi the antelope or Horta the boar chanced in his way when he was hungry, he ate, pausing but long enough to make the kill, and cut himself a steak. Then at last the long journey drew to its close, and he was passing through the last stretch of heavy forest that bounded his estate upon the east, and then this was traversed, and he stood upon the plain's edge looking out across his broad lands towards his home. At the first glance his eyes narrowed and his muscles tensed. Even at that distance he could see that something was amiss. A thin spiral of smoke arose at the right of the bungalow where the barns had stood, but there were no barns there now, and from the bungalow chimney from which smoke should have arisen, there arose nothing. Once again Tarzan of the Apes was speeding onward, this time even more swiftly than before, for he was goaded now by a nameless fear more product of intuition than of reason. Even as the beasts, Tarzan of the Apes seemed to possess a sixth sense. Long before he reached the bungalow, he had almost pictured the scene that finally broke upon his view. Silent and deserted was the vine-covered cottage. Smouldering embers marked the site of his great barns. Gone were the thatched huts of his sturdy retainers, empty the fields, the pastures and corrals. Here and there vultures rose and circled above the carcasses of men and beasts. It was with a feeling as nearly akin to terror as he ever had experienced that the ape-man finally forced himself to enter his home. The first sight that met his eyes set the red haze of hate and bloodlust across his vision, for there, crucified against the wall of the living room, was Wasimbu, giant son of the faithful Muviro, and for over a year the personal bodyguard of Lady Jane. The overturned and shattered furniture of the room, the brown pools of dried blood upon the floor, and prints of bloody hands on walls and woodwork evidenced something of the frightfulness of the battle that had been waged within the narrow confines of the apartment. Across the baby grand piano lay the corpse of another black warrior, while before the door of Lady Jane's boudoir were the dead bodies of 3 more of the faithful Greystoke servants. The door of this room was closed. With drooping shoulders and dull eyes, Tarzan stood gazing dumbly at the insensate panel which hid from him what horrid secret he dared not even guess. Slowly, with leaden feet, he moved toward the door, Gropingly his hand reached for the knob. Thus he stood for another long minute, and then with a sudden gesture he straightened his giant frame, threw back his mighty shoulders, and, with fearless head held high, swung back the door and stepped across the threshold into the room which held for him the dearest memories and associations of his life. No change of expression crossed his grim and stern-set features as he strode across the room and stood beside the little couch and the inanimate form which lay face downward upon it, the still, silent thing that had pulsed with life and youth and love. No tear dimmed the eye of the ape-man, but the God who made him alone could know the thoughts that passed through that still half-savage brain. For a long time he stood there, just looking down upon the dead body, charred beyond recognition, and then he stooped and lifted it in his arms. As he turned the body over and saw how horribly death had been meted, he plumbed, in that instant, the uttermost depths of grief and horror and hatred. Nor did he require the evidence of the broken German rifle in the outer room, or the torn and blood-stained service cap upon the floor, to tell him who had been the perpetrators of this horrid and useless crime. For a moment he had hoped against hope that the blackened corpse was not that of his mate, but when his eyes discovered and recognized the rings upon her fingers, the last faint ray of hope forsook him. In silence, in love, and in reverence he buried, in the little rose garden that had been Jane Clayton's pride and love, the poor, charred form, and beside it the great black warriors who had given their lives so futilely in their mistress' protection. At one side of the house Tarzan found other newly made graves, and in these he sought final evidence of the identity of the real perpetrators of the atrocities that had been committed there in his absence. Here he disinterred the bodies of a dozen German askaris and found upon their uniforms the insignia of the company and regiment to which they had belonged. This was enough for the ape-man. White officers had commanded these men, nor would it be a difficult task to discover who they were. Returning to the rose garden, he stood among the Hun-trampled blooms and bushes above the grave of his dead. With bowed head he stood there in a last mute farewell. As the sun sank slowly behind the towering forests of the west, he turned slowly away upon the still distinct trail of Hauptmann Fritz Schneider and his blood-stained company. His was the suffering of the dumb brute, mute but though voiceless no less poignant. At first his vast sorrow numbed his other faculties of thought. His brain was overwhelmed by the calamity to such an extent that it reacted to but a single objective suggestion: she is dead. She is dead, she is dead. Again and again this phrase beat monotonously upon his brain, a dull, throbbing pain, yet mechanically his feet followed the trail of her slayer, while subconsciously his every sense was upon the alert for the ever-present perils of the jungle. Gradually the labor of his great grief brought forth another emotion so real, so tangible, that it seemed a companion walking at his side. It was hate, and it brought to him a measure of solace and of comfort, for it was a sublime hate that ennobled him, as it has ennobled countless thousands since hatred for Germany and Germans. It centered about the slayer of his mate, of course, but it included everything German, animate or inanimate. As the thought took firm hold upon him, he paused, and raising his face to Goro, the moon, cursed with upraised hand the authors of the hideous crime that had been perpetrated in that once peaceful bungalow behind him, and he cursed their progenitors, their progeny, and all their kind, the while he took silent oath to war upon them relentlessly until death overtook him. There followed almost immediately a feeling of content, for where before his future at best seemed but a void, now it was filled with possibilities, the contemplation of which brought him, if not happiness, at least a surcease of absolute grief. For before him lay a great work that would occupy his time. Stripped not only of all the outward symbols of civilization, Tarzan had also reverted morally and mentally to the status of the savage beast he had been reared. Never had his civilization been more than a veneer put on for the sake of her he loved, because he thought it made her happier to see him thus. In reality, he had always held the outward evidences of so-called culture in deep contempt. Civilization meant to Tarzan of the Apes a curtailment of freedom in all its aspects: freedom of action, freedom of thought, freedom of love, freedom of hate. Clothes he abhorred, uncomfortable, hideous, confining things that reminded him somehow of bonds securing him to the life he had seen the poor creatures of London and Paris living. Clothes were the emblems of that hypocrisy for which civilization stood, a pretense that the wearers were ashamed of what the clothes covered, of the human form made in the semblance of God. Tarzan knew how silly and pathetic the lower orders of animals appeared in the clothing of civilization, for he had seen several poor creatures thus apparelled in various traveling shows in Europe, and he knew too How silly and pathetic man appears in them, since the only men he had seen in the first 20 years of his life had been, like himself, naked savages. The ape-man had a keen admiration for a well-muscled, well-proportioned body, whether lion or antelope or man, and it had ever been beyond him to understand how clothes could be considered more beautiful than a clear, firm, healthy skin, or coat and trousers more graceful than the gentle curves of rounded muscles playing beneath a flexible hide. In civilization, Tarzan had found greed and selfishness and cruelty far beyond that which he had known in his familiar, savage jungle, and though civilization had given him his mate and several friends whom he loved and admired, he never had come to accept it as you and I who have known little or nothing else, so it was with a sense of relief that he now definitely abandoned it and all that it stood for, and went forth into the jungle once again stripped to his loincloth and weapons. The hunting knife of his father hung at his left hip, his bow and his quiver of arrows were slung across his shoulders, while around his chest over one shoulder and beneath the opposite arm was coiled the long grass rope without which Tarzan would have felt quite as naked as would you should you be suddenly thrust upon a busy highway clad only in a Union suit. A heavy war spear which he sometimes carried in one hand and again slung by a thong about his neck so that it hung down his back completed his armament and his apparel. The diamond-studded locket with the pictures of his mother and father that he had worn always until he had given it as a token of his highest devotion to Jane Clayton before their marriage was missing. She always had worn it since, but it had not been upon her body when he found her slain in her boudoir, so that now his quest for vengeance included also a quest for the stolen trinket. Toward midnight, Tarzan commenced to feel the physical strain of his long hours of travel and to realize that even muscles such as his had their limitations. His pursuit of the murderers had not been characterized by excessive speed, but rather more in keeping with his mental attitude, which was marked by a dogged determination to require from the Germans more than an eye for an eye and more than a tooth for a tooth. The element of time entering but slightly into his calculations. Inwardly as well as outwardly, Tarzan had reverted to beast, and in the lives of beasts, time, as a measurable aspect of duration, has no meaning. The beast is actively interested only in now, and as it is always now and always shall be, there is an eternity of time for the accomplishment of objects. The ape-man naturally had a slightly more comprehensive realization of the limitations of time, but, like the beasts, he moved with majestic deliberation when no emergency prompted him to swift action. Having dedicated his life to vengeance, vengeance became his natural state, and therefore no emergency, so he took his time in pursuit. That he had not rested earlier was due to the fact that he had felt no fatigue, his mind being occupied by thoughts of sorrow and revenge, but now he realized that he was tired, and so he sought a jungle giant that had harbored him upon more than a single other jungle night. Dark clouds moving swiftly across the heavens now and again eclipsed the bright face of Goro the moon and forewarned the ape-man of impending storm. In the depth of the jungle, the cloud shadows produced a thick blackness that might almost be felt, a blackness that to you and me might have proven terrifying with its accompaniment of rustling leaves and cracking twigs, and its even more suggestive intervals of utter silence in which the crudest of imaginations might have conjured crouching beasts of prey tensed for the fatal charge, but through it Tarzan passed unconcerned, yet always alert. Now he swung lightly to the lower terraces of the overarching trees when some subtle sense warned him that Numa lay upon a kill directly in his path, or again he sprang lightly to one side as Buto, the rhinoceros, lumbered toward him along the narrow, deep-worn trail for the ape-man, ready to fight upon necessity's slightest pretext, avoided unnecessary quarrels. When he swung himself at last into the tree he sought, the moon was obscured by a heavy cloud, and the tree-tops were waving wildly in a steadily increasing wind, whose soughing drowned the lesser noises of the jungle. Upward went Tarzan toward a sturdy crotch across which he long since had laid and secured a little platform of branches. It was very dark now, darker even than it had been before, for almost the entire sky was overcast by thick, black clouds. Presently the man-beast paused, his sensitive nostrils dilating as he sniffed the air about him. Then, with the swiftness and agility of a cat, he leapt far outward upon a swaying branch, sprang upward through the darkness, caught another, swung himself upon it, and then to one still higher. What could have so suddenly transformed his matter-of-fact ascent of the giant bole to the swift and wary action of his detour among the branches? You or I could have seen nothing, not even the little platform that an instant before had been just above him, and which now was immediately below, but as he swung above it, we should have heard an ominous growl, and then as the moon was momentarily uncovered, we should have seen both the platform, dimly, and a dark mass that lay stretched upon it, a dark mass that presently, as our eyes became accustomed to the lesser darkness, would take the form of Sheeta the panther. In answer to the cat's growl, a low and equally ferocious growl rumbled upward from the ape-man's deep chest, a growl of warning that told the panther he was trespassing upon the other's lair, but Sheeta was in no mood to be dispossessed. With upturned, snarling face, he glared at the brown-skinned Tarmangani above him. Very slowly the ape-man moved inward along the branch until he was directly above the panther. In the man's hand was the hunting knife of his long-dead father, the weapon that had first given him his real ascendancy over the beasts of the jungle, but he hoped not to be forced to use it, knowing as he did that more jungle battles were settled by hideous growling than by actual combat. The law of bluff holding quite as good in the jungle as elsewhere, only in matters of love and food did the great beasts ordinarily close with fangs and talons. Tarzan braced himself against the bole of the tree and leaned closer toward Sheeta. "Stealer of Balas," he cried. The panther rose to a sitting position, his bared fangs but a few feet from the ape-man's taunting face. Tarzan growled hideously and struck at the cat's face with his knife. "I am Tarzan of the apes," he roared. "This is Tarzan's lair. Go, or I will kill you." Though he spoke in the language of the great apes of the jungle, it is doubtful that Sheeta understood the words. Though he knew well enough that the hairless ape wished to frighten him from his well-chosen station, past which edible creatures might be expected to wander sometime during the watches of the night. Like lightning, the cat reared and struck a vicious blow at his tormentor with great bared talons that might well have torn away the ape-man's face had the blow landed, but it did not land. Tarzan was even quicker than Sheeta. As the panther came to all fours again upon the little platform, Tarzan slung his heavy spear and prodded at the snarling face, and as Sheeta warded off the blows, the two continued their horrid duet of blood-curdling roars and growls. Goaded to frenzy, the cat presently determined to come up after this disturber of his peace, but when he essayed to leap to the branch that held Tarzan, he found the sharp spear point always in his face, and each time as he dropped back he was prodded viciously in some tender part. But at length, rage having conquered his better judgment, he leapt up the rough bole to the very branch upon which Tarzan stood. Now the two faced each other upon even footing, and Sheeta saw a quick revenge and a supper all in one. The hairless ape-thing with the tiny fangs and the puny talons would be helpless before him. The heavy limb bent beneath the weight of the two beasts as Sheeta crept cautiously out upon it, and Tarzan backed slowly away, growling. The wind had risen to the proportions of a gale, so that even the greatest giants of the forest swayed, groaning to its force, and the branch upon which the two faced each other rose and fell like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. Goro was now entirely obscured, but vivid flashes of lightning lit up the jungle at brief intervals, revealing the grim tableau of primitive passion upon the swaying limb. Tarzan backed away, drawing Sheeta farther from the stem of the tree and out upon the tapering branch, where his footing became ever more precarious. The cat, infuriated by the pain of spear wounds, was overstepping the bounds of caution. Already he had reached a point where he could do little more than maintain a secure footing, and it was this moment that Tarzan chose to charge. With a roar that mingled with the booming thunder from above, he leapt toward the panther, who could only claw futilely with one huge paw while he clung to the branch with the other, but the ape-man did not come within that parabola of destruction. Instead, he leaped above menacing claws and snapping fangs, turning in mid-air and alighting upon Sheeta's back, and at the instant of impact his knife struck deep into the tawny side. Then Sheeta, impelled by pain and hate and rage and the first law of nature, went mad. Screaming and clawing, he attempted to turn upon the ape-thing clinging to his back. For an instant he toppled upon the now wildly gyrating limb, clutched frantically to save himself, and then plunged downward into the darkness with Tarzan still clinging to him. Crashing through splintering branches, the two fell. Not for an instant did the ape-man consider relinquishing his death hold upon his adversary. He had entered the lists in mortal combat, and true to the primitive instincts of the wild, the unwritten law of the jungle, one or both must die before the battle ended. Sheeta, cat-like, alighted upon four outsprawled feet, the weight of the ape-man crushing him to earth, the long knife again embedded in his side. Once the panther struggled to rise, but only to sink to earth again. Tarzan felt the giant muscles relax beneath him. Sheeta was dead. Rising, the ape-man placed a foot upon the body of his vanquished foe, raised his face toward the thundering heavens, and as the lightning flashed and the torrential rain broke upon him, screamed forth the wild victory cry of the bull-ape. Having accomplished his aim and driven the enemy from his lair, Tarzan gathered an armful of large fronds and climbed to his dripping couch. Laying a few of the fronds upon the poles, he lay down and covered himself against the rain with the others, and despite the wailing of the wind and the crashing of the thunder, immediately fell asleep. Chapter 2. The Lion's Cave. The rain lasted for 24 hours, and much of the time it fell in torrents, so that when it ceased, the trail he had been following was entirely obliterated. Cold and uncomfortable, it was a savage Tarzan who threaded the mazes of the soggy jungle. Manu the monkey, shivering and chattering in the dank trees, scolded and fled at his approach. Even the panthers and the lions let the growling Tarmangani pass unmolested. When the sun shone again upon the second day and a wide open plain let the full heat of kudu flood the chilled, brown-bodied Tarzan's spirits rose, but it was still a sullen, surly brute that moved steadily onward into the south, where he hoped again to pick up the trail of the Germans. He was now in German East Africa, and it was his intention to skirt the mountains west of Kilimanjaro, whose rugged peaks he was quite willing to give a wide berth, and then swing eastward along the south side of the range to the railway that led to Tanga. For his experience among men suggested that it was toward this railroad that German troops would be likely to converge. 2 days later, from the southern slopes of Kilimanjaro, he heard the boom of cannon far away to the east. The afternoon had been dull and cloudy, and now as he was passing through a narrow gorge, a few great drops of rain began to splatter upon his naked shoulders. Tarzan shook his head and growled his disapproval. Then he cast his eyes about for shelter, for he had had quite enough of the cold and drenching. He wanted to hasten on in the direction of the booming noise, for he knew that there would be Germans fighting against the English. For an instant his bosom swelled with pride at the thought that he was English, and then he shook his head again viciously. "No," he muttered, "Tarzan of the Apes is not English, for the English are men, and Tarzan is Tarmangani." But he could not hide even from his sorrow, or from his sullen hatred of mankind in general, that his heart warmed at the thought it was Englishmen who fought the Germans. His regret was that the English were human and not great white apes, as he again considered himself. Tomorrow, he thought, I will travel that way and find the Germans, and then he set himself to the immediate task of discovering some shelter from the storm. Presently he espied the low and narrow entrance to what appeared to be a cave at the base of the cliffs which formed the northern side of the gorge. With drawn knife he approached the spot warily, for he knew that if it were a cave, it was doubtless the lair of some other beast. Before the entrance lay many large fragments of rock of different sizes, similar to others, scattered along the entire base of the cliff. And it was in Tarzan's mind that if he found the cave unoccupied, he would barricade the door and ensure himself a quiet and peaceful night's repose within the sheltered interior. Let the storm rage without, Tarzan would remain within until it ceased, comfortable and dry. A tiny rivulet of cold water trickled outward from the opening. Close to the cave, Tarzan kneeled and sniffed the ground. A low growl escaped him, and his upper lip curved to expose his fighting fangs. "Numa," he muttered, but he did not stop. Numa might not be at home. He would investigate. The entrance was so low that the ape-man was compelled to drop to all fours before he could poke his head within the aperture, but first he looked, listened, and sniffed in each direction at his rear. He would not be taken by surprise from that quarter. His first glance within the cave revealed a narrow tunnel with daylight at its farther end. The interior of the tunnel was not so dark, but that the ape-man could readily see that it was untenanted at present. Advancing cautiously, he crawled toward the opposite end, imbued with a full realization of what it would mean if Numa should suddenly enter the tunnel in front of him. But Numa did not appear, and the ape-man emerged at length into the open and stood erect. Finding himself in a rocky cleft whose precipitous walls rose almost sheer on every hand, the tunnel from the gorge passing through the cliff and forming a passageway from the outer world into a large pocket or gulch entirely enclosed by steep walls of rock. Except for the small passageway from the gorge, there was no other entrance to the gulch, which was some 100 feet in length and about 50 in width, and appeared to have been worn from the rocky cliff by the falling of water during long ages. A tiny stream from Kilimanjaro's eternal snowcap still trickled over the edge of the rocky wall at the upper end of the gulch, forming a little pool at the bottom of the cliff, from which a small rivulet wound downward to the tunnel through which it passed to the gorge beyond. A single great tree flourished near the center of the gulch, while tufts of wiry grass were scattered here and there among the rocks of the gravelly floor. The bones of many large animals lay about, and among them were several human skulls. Tarzan raised his eyebrows. "A man-eater," he murmured, "and from appearances he has held sway here for a long time. Tonight Tarzan will take the lair of the man-eater, and Numa may roar and grumble upon the outside." The ape-man had advanced well into the gulch as he investigated his surroundings, and now as he stood near the tree, satisfied that the tunnel would prove a dry and quiet retreat for the night. He turned to retrace his way to the outer end of the entrance that he might block it with boulders against Numa's return, but even with the thought there came something to his sensitive ears that froze him into statuesque immobility with eyes glued upon the tunnel's mouth. A moment later the head of a huge lion framed in a great black mane appeared in the opening. The yellow-green eyes glared, round and unblinking, straight at the trespassing Tarmangani. A low growl rumbled from the deep chest, and lips curled back to expose the mighty fangs. "Brother of Dango," shouted Tarzan, angered that Numa's return should have been so timed as to frustrate his plans for a comfortable night's repose. "I am Tarzan of the Apes, Lord of the Jungle. Tonight I lay here go." But Numa did not go. Instead he rumbled forth a menacing roar and took a few steps in Tarzan's direction. The ape man picked up a rock and hurled it at the snarling face. One can never be sure of a lion. This one might turn tail and run at the first intimation of attack. Tarzan had bluffed many in his time, but not now. The missile struck Numa full upon the snout, a tender part of a cat's anatomy, and instead of causing him to flee, it transformed him into an infuriated engine of wrath and destruction. Up went his tail, stiff and erect, and with a series of frightful roars he bore down upon the Tarmangani at the speed of an express train. Not an instant too soon did Tarzan reach the tree and swing himself into its branches, and there he squatted, hurling insults at the king of beasts while Numa paced a circle beneath him, growling and roaring in rage. It was raining now, in earnest, adding to the ape-man's discomfort and disappointment. He was very angry, but as only direct necessity had ever led him to close in mortal combat with a lion, knowing as he did that he had only luck and agility to pit against the frightful odds of muscle, weight, fangs, and talons. He did not now even consider descending and engaging in so unequal and useless a duel for the mere reward of a little added creature comfort. And so he sat perched in the tree while the rain fell steadily and the lion padded round and round beneath, casting a baleful eye upward after every few steps. Tarzan scanned the precipitous walls for an avenue of escape. They would have baffled an ordinary man, but the ape-man, accustomed to climbing, saw several places where he might gain a foothold, precarious possibly, but enough to give him reasonable assurance of escape if Numa would but betake himself to the far end of the gulch for a moment. Numa, however, notwithstanding the rain, gave no evidence of quitting his post, so that at last Tarzan really began to consider seriously if it might not be as well to take the chance of a battle with him rather than remain longer cold and wet and humiliated in the tree. But even as he turned the matter over in his mind, Numa turned suddenly and walked majestically toward the tunnel without even a backward glance. The instant that he disappeared, Tarzan dropped lightly to the ground upon the far side of the tree and was away at top speed for the cliff. The lion had no sooner entered the tunnel than he backed immediately out again and, pivoting like a flash, was off across the gulch in full charge after the flying ape-man, but Tarzan's lead was too great. If he could find finger or foothold upon the sheer wall, he would be safe. But should he slip from the wet rocks, his doom was already sealed, as he would fall directly into Numa's clutches, where even the great Tarmangani would be helpless. With the agility of a cat, Tarzan ran up the cliff for 30 feet before he paused, and there finding a secure foothold, he stopped and looked down upon Numa, who was leaping upward in a wild and futile attempt to scale the rocky wall to his prey. 15 or 20 feet from the ground, the lion would scramble only to fall backward again defeated. Tarzan eyed him for a moment and then commenced a slow and cautious ascent toward the summit. Several times he had difficulty in finding holds, but at last he drew himself over the edge, rose, picked up a bit of loose rock, hurled it at Numa, and strode away. Finding an easy descent to the gorge, he was about to pursue his journey in the direction of the still booming guns when a sudden thought caused him to halt, and a half smile to play about his lips. Turning, he trotted quickly back to the outer opening of Numa's tunnel. Close beside it, he listened for a moment and then rapidly began to gather large rocks and pile them within the entrance. He had almost closed the aperture when the lion appeared upon the inside, a very ferocious and angry lion that pawed and clawed at the rocks and uttered mighty roars that caused the earth to tremble, but roars did not frighten Tarzan of the Apes. At Kala's shaggy breast he had closed his infant eyes in sleep upon countless nights in years gone by to the savage chorus of similar roars. Scarcely a day or night of his jungle life, and practically all his life had been spent in the jungle, had he not heard the roaring of hungry lions or angry lions, or angry lions or lovesick lions. Such sounds affected Tarzan as the tooting of an automobile horn may affect you. If you are in front of the automobile, it warns you out of the way. If you are not in front of it, you scarcely notice it. Figuratively, Tarzan was not in front of the automobile. Numa could not reach him, and Tarzan knew it, so he continued deliberately to choke the entrance until there was no possibility of Numa's getting out again. When he was quite through, he made a grimace at the hidden lion beyond the barrier and resumed his way toward the east. "A man-eater who will eat no more men," he soliloquized. That night, Tarzan lay up under an overhanging shelf of rock. The next morning, he resumed his journey, stopping only long enough to make a kill and satisfy his hunger. The other beasts of the wild eat and lie up, but Tarzan never let his belly interfere with his plans. In this lay one of the greatest differences between the ape-man and his fellows of the jungles and forests. The firing ahead rose and fell during the day. He had noticed that it was highest at dawn and immediately after dusk, and that during the night it almost ceased. In the middle of the afternoon of the second day, he came upon troops moving up toward the front. They appeared to be raiding parties, for they drove goats and cows along with them, and there were native porters laden with grain and other foodstuffs. He saw that these natives were all secured by neck chains, and he also saw that the troops were composed of native soldiers in German uniforms. The officers were white men. No one saw Tarzan, yet he was here and thereabout, and among them for 2 hours. He inspected the insignia upon their uniforms and saw that they were not the same as that which he had taken from one of the dead soldiers at the bungalow, and then he passed on ahead of them, unseen in the dense bush. He had come upon Germans and had not killed them, but it was because the killing of Germans at large was not yet the prime motive of his existence. Now it was to discover the individual who slew his mate. After he had accounted for him, he would take up the little matter of slaying all Germans who crossed his path, and he meant that many should cross it, for he would hunt them precisely as professional hunters hunt the man-eaters. As he neared the front lines, the troops became more numerous. There were motor trucks and ox teams and all the impedimenta of a small army, and always there were wounded men walking or being carried toward the rear. He had crossed the railroad some distance back and judged that the wounded were being taken to it for transportation to a base hospital, and possibly as far away as Tanga on the coast. It was dusk when he reached a large camp hidden in the foothills of the Pear Mountains. As he was approaching from the rear, he found it but lightly guarded, and what sentinels there were not upon the alert, and so it was an easy thing for him to enter after darkness had fallen and prowl about, listening at the backs of tents, searching for some clue to the slayer of his mate. As he paused at the side of a tent before which sat a number of native soldiers, he caught a few words spoken in native dialect that riveted his attention instantly. The Waziri fought like devils. But we are greater fighters, and we killed them all. When we were through, the captain came and killed the woman. He stayed outside and yelled in a very loud voice until all the men were killed. Under Lieutenant von Goss's braver, he came in and stood beside the door shouting at us, also in a very loud voice, and bade us nail one of the Waziri who was wounded to the wall. And then he laughed loudly because the man suffered. We all laughed. It was very funny. Like a beast of prey, grim and terrible, Tarzan crouched in the shadows beside the tent. What thoughts passed through that savage mind, who may say? No outward sign of passion was revealed by the expression of the handsome face. The cold, grey eyes denoted only intense watchfulness. Presently the soldier Tarzan had heard first rose and with a parting word turned away. He passed within 10 feet of the ape-man and continued on toward the rear of the camp. Tarzan followed, and in the shadows of a clump of bushes overtook his quarry. There was no sound as the man-beast sprang upon the back of his prey and bore it to the ground, for steel fingers closed simultaneously upon the soldier's throat, effectually stifling any outcry. By the neck, Tarzan dragged his victim well into the concealment of the bushes. "Make no sound," he cautioned in the man's own tribal dialect, as he released his hold upon the other's throat. The fellow gasped for breath, rolling frightened eyes upward to see what manner of creature it might be in whose power he was. In the darkness he saw only a naked brown body bending above him, but he still remembered the terrific strength of the mighty muscles that had closed upon his wind and dragged him into the bushes as though he had been but a little child. If any thought of resistance had crossed his mind, he must have discarded it at once, as he made no move to escape. "What is the name of the officer who killed the woman at the bungalow where you fought with the Waziri?" asked Tarzan. "Hauptmann Schneider," replied the black when he could again command his voice. "Where is he?" demanded the ape-man. "He is here. It may be that he is at headquarters. Many of the officers go there in the evening to receive orders." "Lead me there," commanded Tarzan, "and if I am discovered I will kill you immediately. Get up." The black rose and led the way by a roundabout route back through the camp. Several times they were forced to hide while soldiers passed, but at last they reached a great pile of baled hay, from about the corner of which the black pointed out a 2-story building in the distance. "Headquarters," he said. "You can go no farther unseen. There are many soldiers about." Tarzan realized that he could not proceed farther in company with the black. He turned and looked at the fellow for a moment as though pondering what disposition to make of him. "You helped to crucify Wasimbu, the Waziri," he accused in a low yet nonetheless terrible tone. The black trembled, his knees giving beneath him. "He ordered us to do it," he pleaded. "Who ordered it done?" demanded Tarzan. "Under Lieutenant von Goss," replied the soldier. "He too is here." "I shall find him," returned Tarzan grimly. "You helped to crucify Wasimbu, the Waziri, and while he suffered you laughed." The fellow reeled. It was as though in the accusation he read also his death sentence. With no other word, Tarzan seized the man again by the neck. As before, there was no outcry. The giant muscles tensed. The arms swung quickly upward, and with them the body of the black soldier who had helped to crucify Wasimbu, the Waziri, described a circle in the air once, twice, 3 times, and then it was flung aside, and the ape-man turned in the direction of General Kraut's headquarters. A single sentinel in the rear of the building barred the way. Tarzan crawled, belly to the ground, toward him, taking advantage of cover as only the jungle-bred beast of prey can do. When the sentinel's eyes were toward him, Tarzan hugged the ground, motionless as stone. When they were turned away, he moved swiftly forward. Presently he was within charging distance. He waited until the man had turned his back once more, and then he rose and sped noiselessly down upon him. Again there was no sound as he carried the dead body with him toward the building. The lower floor was lighted, the upper dark. Through the windows Tarzan saw a large front room and a smaller room in rear of it. In the former were many officers. Some moved about talking to one another, others sat at field tables writing. The windows were open and Tarzan could hear much of the conversation, but nothing that interested him. It was mostly about the German successes in Africa and conjectures as to when the German army in Europe would reach Paris. Some said the Kaiser was doubtlessly already there, and there was a great deal of damning Belgium. In the smaller back room a large, red-faced man sat behind a table. Some other officers were also sitting a little in rear of him, while 2 stood at attention before the general, who was questioning them. As he talked, the general toyed with an oil lamp that stood upon the table before him. Presently there came a knock upon the door and an aide entered the room. He saluted and reported, "Fräulein Kircher has arrived, sir." "Bid her enter," commanded the general, and then nodded to the 2 officers before him in sign of dismissal. The Fräulein, entering, passed them at the door. The officers in the little room rose and saluted, the Fräulein acknowledging the courtesy with a bow and a slight smile. She was a very pretty girl. Even the rough, soiled riding habit and the caked dust upon her face could not conceal the fact, and she was young. She could not have been over 19. She advanced to the table behind which the general stood and, taking a folded paper from an inside pocket of her coat, handed it to him. "Be seated, Fräulein," he said, and another officer brought her a chair. No one spoke while the general read the contents of the paper. Tarzan appraised the various people in the room. He wondered if one might not be Hauptmann Schneider, for 2 of them were captains. The girl he judged to be of the intelligence department, a spy. Her beauty held no appeal for him. Without a glimmer of compunction he could have wrung that fair young neck. She was German and that was enough, but he had other and more important work before him. He wanted Hauptmann Schneider. Finally the general looked up from the paper. "Good," he said to the girl, and then to one of his aides, "Send for Major Schneider." Major Schneider. Tarzan felt the short hairs at the back of his neck rise. Already they had promoted the beast who had murdered his mate. Doubtless they had promoted him for that very crime. The aide left the room and the others fell into a general conversation from which it became apparent to Tarzan that the German East African forces greatly outnumbered the British and that the latter were suffering heavily. The ape-man stood so concealed in a clump of bushes that he could watch the interior of the room without being seen from within, while he was at the same time hidden from the view of anyone who might chance to pass along the post of the sentinel he had slain. Momentarily he was expecting a patrol or a relief to appear and discover that the sentinel was missing, when he knew an immediate and thorough search would be made. Impatiently he awaited the coming of the man he sought, and at last he was rewarded by the reappearance of the aide who had been dispatched to fetch him, accompanied by an officer of medium size with fierce, upstanding moustaches. The newcomer strode to the table, halted and saluted, reporting. The general acknowledged the salute and turned toward the girl. "Fräulein Kircher," he said, "allow me to present Major Schneider." Tarzan waited to hear no more. Placing a palm upon the sill of the window, he vaulted into the room, into the midst of an astounded company of the Kaiser's officers. With a stride he was at the table, and with a sweep of his hand sent the lamp crashing into the fat belly of the general, who, in his mad effort to escape cremation, fell over backward, chair and all, upon the floor. Two of the aides sprang for the ape-man, who picked up the first and flung him in the face of the other. The girl had leaped from her chair and stood flattened against the wall. The other officers were calling aloud for the guard and for help. Tarzan's purpose centered upon but a single individual, and him he never lost sight of. Freed from attack for an instant, he seized Major Schneider, threw him over his shoulder, and was out of the window so quickly that the astonished assemblage could scarce realize what had occurred. A single glance showed him that the sentinel's post was still vacant, and a moment later he and his burden were in the shadows of the hay dump. Major Schneider had made no outcry for the very excellent reason that his wind was shut off. Now Tarzan released his grasp enough to permit the man to breathe. "If you make a sound you will be choked again," he said. Cautiously and after infinite patience, Tarzan passed the final outpost. Forcing his captive to walk before him, he pushed on toward the west until, late into the night, he recrossed the railway where he felt reasonably safe from discovery. The German had cursed and grumbled and threatened and asked questions, but his only reply was another prod from Tarzan's sharp war spear. The ape-man herded him along as he would have driven a hog, with the difference that he would have had more respect, and therefore more consideration for a hog. Until now Tarzan had given little thought to the details of revenge. Now he pondered what form the punishment should take. Of only one thing was he certain: it must end in death. Like all brave men and courageous beasts, Tarzan had little natural inclination to torture, none, in fact, but this case was unique in his experience. An inherent sense of justice called for an eye for an eye for an eye, and his recent oath demanded even more. Yes, the creature must suffer even as he had caused Jane Clayton to suffer. Tarzan could not hope to make the man suffer as he had suffered, since physical pain may never approach the exquisiteness of mental torture. All through the long night the ape-man goaded on the exhausted and now terrified Hun. The awful silence of his captor wrought upon the German's nerves. If he would only speak. Again and again Schneider tried to force or coax a word from him, but always the result was the same continued silence and a vicious and painful prod from the spear point. Schneider was bleeding and sore. He was so exhausted that he staggered at every step, and often he fell only to be prodded to his feet again by that terrifying and remorseless spear. It was not until morning that Tarzan reached a decision, and it came to him then like an inspiration from above. A slow smile touched his lips, and he immediately sought a place to lie up and rest. He wished his prisoner to be fit now for what lay in store for him. Ahead was a stream which Tarzan had crossed the day before. He knew the ford for a drinking place, and a likely spot to make an easy kill. Cautioning the German to utter silence with a gesture, the two approached the stream quietly. Down the game trail Tarzan saw some deer about to leave the water. He shoved Schneider into the brush at one side and, squatting next him, waited. The German watched the silent giant with puzzled, frightened eyes. In the new dawn he, for the first time, was able to obtain a good look at his captor, and if he had been puzzled and frightened before, those sensations were nothing to what he experienced now. Who and what could this almost naked white savage be? He had heard him speak but once, when he had cautioned him to silence, and then in excellent German and the well-modulated tones of culture. He watched him now as the fascinated toad watches the snake that is about to devour it. He saw the graceful limbs and symmetrical body motionless as a marble statue as the creature crouched in the concealment of the leafy foliage. Not a muscle, not a nerve moved. He saw the deer coming slowly along the trail, downwind and unsuspecting. He saw a buck pass an old buck, and then a young and plump one came opposite the giant in ambush. And Schneider's eyes went wide, and a scream of terror almost broke from his lips as he saw the agile beast at his side spring straight for the throat of the young buck, and heard from those human lips the hunting roar of a wild beast. Down went the buck, and Tarzan and his captive had meat. The ape-man ate his raw, but he permitted the German to build a fire and cook his portion. The two lay up until late in the afternoon, and then took up the journey once again, a journey that was so frightful to Schneider because of his ignorance of its destination that he at times groveled at Tarzan's feet, begging for an explanation and for mercy, but on and on in silence the ape-man went, prodding the failing Hun whenever the latter faltered. It was noon of the third day before they reached their destination. After a steep climb and a short walk, they halted at the edge of a precipitous cliff, and Schneider looked down into a narrow gulch where a single tree grew beside a tiny rivulet and sparse grass broke from a rock-strewn soil. Tarzan motioned him over the edge, but the German drew back in terror. The ape-man seized him and pushed him roughly toward the brink. "Descend," he said. It was the second time he had spoken in 3 days, and perhaps his very silence, ominous in itself, had done more to arouse terror in the breast of the Boche than even the spear point, ever ready as it always was. Schneider looked fearfully over the edge, but was about to essay the attempt when Tarzan halted him. "I am Lord Greystoke," he said. "It was my wife you murdered in the Waziri country. You will understand now why I came for you. Descend." The German fell upon his knees. "I did not murder your wife," he cried. "Have mercy. I did not murder your wife. I do not know anything about." "Descend," snapped Tarzan, raising the point of his spear. He knew that the man lied and was not surprised that he did. A man who would murder for no cause would lie for less. Schneider still hesitated and pled. The ape-man jabbed him with the spear, and Schneider slid fearfully over the top and began the perilous descent. Tarzan accompanied and assisted him over the worst places until at last they were within a few feet of the bottom. "Be quiet now," cautioned the ape-man. He pointed at the entrance to what appeared to be a cave at the far end of the gulch. "There is a hungry lion in there. If you can reach that tree before he discovers you, you will have several days longer in which to enjoy life. And then when you are too weak to cling longer to the branches of the tree Numa, the man-eater will feed again for the last time." He pushed Schneider from his foothold to the ground below. "Now run," he said. The German, trembling in terror, started for the tree. He had almost reached it when a horrid roar broke from the mouth of the cave, and almost simultaneously a gaunt, hunger-mad lion leaped into the daylight of the gulch. Schneider had but a few yards to cover, but the lion flew over the ground to circumvent him while Tarzan watched the race with a slight smile upon his lips. Schneider won by a slender margin, and as Tarzan scaled the cliff to the summit, he heard behind him, mingled with the roaring of the baffled cat, the gibbering of a human voice that was at the same time more bestial than the beast's. Upon the brink of the cliff, the ape-man turned and looked back into the gulch. High in the tree, the German clung frantically to a branch across which his body lay. Beneath him was Numa waiting. The ape-man raised his face to Kudu the sun, and from his mighty chest rose the savage victory cry of the bull ape. Chapter 3. In the German lines. Tarzan was not yet fully revenged. There were many millions of Germans yet alive enough to keep Tarzan pleasantly occupied the balance of his life, and yet not enough, should he kill them all, to recompense him for the great loss he had suffered, nor could the death of all those million Germans bring back his loved one. While in the German camp in the Pear Mountains, which lie just east of the boundary line between German and British East Africa, Tarzan had overheard enough to suggest that the British were getting the worst of the fighting in Africa. At first he had given the matter but little thought, since after the death of his wife, the one strong tie that had held him to civilization, he had renounced all mankind, considering himself no longer man but ape. After accounting for Schneider as satisfactorily as lay within his power, he circled Kilimanjaro and hunted in the foothills to the north of that mightiest of mountains, as he had discovered that in the neighborhood of the armies there was no hunting at all. Some pleasure he derived through conjuring mental pictures from time to time of the German he had left in the branches of the lone tree at the bottom of the high-walled gulch, in which was penned the starving lion. He could imagine the man's mental anguish as he became weakened from hunger and maddened by thirst, knowing that sooner or later he must slip exhausted to the ground where waited the gaunt man-eater. Tarzan wondered if Schneider would have the courage to descend to the little rivulet for water should Numa leave the gulch and enter the cave, and then he pictured the mad race for the tree again when the lion charged out to seize his prey, as he was certain to do. Since the clumsy German could not descend to the rivulet without making at least some slight noise that would attract Numa's attention. But even this pleasure palled, and more the ape-man found himself thinking of the English soldiers fighting against heavy odds, and especially of the fact that it was Germans who were beating them. The thought made him lower his head and growl, and it worried him not a little a bit, perhaps because he was finding it difficult to forget that he was an Englishman when he wanted only to be an ape. And at last the time came when he could not longer endure the thought of Germans killing Englishmen while he hunted in safety a bare march away. His decision made, he set out in the direction of the German camp, no well-defined plan formulated, but with the general idea that once near the field of operations he might find an opportunity to harass the German command as he so well knew how to do. His way took him along the gorge close to the gulch in which he had left Schneider, and yielding to a natural curiosity, he scaled the cliffs and made his way to the edge of the gulch. The tree was empty, nor was there sign of Numa, the lion. Picking up a rock, he hurled it into the gulch, where it rolled to the very entrance to the cave. Instantly the lion appeared in the aperture, but such a different-looking lion from the great sleek brute that Tarzan had trapped there 2 weeks before. Now he was gaunt and emaciated, and when he walked he staggered. "Where is the German?" shouted Tarzan. Was he good eating, or only a bag of bones when he slipped and fell from the tree? Numa growled. "You look hungry," Numa continued, the ape-man. "You must have been very hungry to eat all the grass from your lair and even the bark from the tree as far up as you can reach. Would you like another German?" And smiling, he turned away. A few minutes later he came suddenly upon Bara, the deer, asleep beneath a tree, and as Tarzan was hungry he made a quick kill, and squatting beside his prey proceeded to eat his fill. As he was gnawing the last morsel from a bone, his quick ears caught the padding of stealthy feet behind him, and turning he confronted Dango, the hyena, sneaking upon him. With a growl, the ape-man picked up a fallen branch and hurled it at the skulking brute. "Go away, eater of carrion," he cried, but Dango was hungry, and being large and powerful, he only snarled and circled slowly about as though watching for an opportunity to charge. Tarzan of the Apes knew Dango even better than Dango knew himself. He knew that the brute, made savage by hunger, was mustering its courage for an attack, that it was probably accustomed to man and therefore more or less fearless of him, and so he unslung his heavy spear and laid it ready at his side while he continued his meal, all the time keeping a watchful eye upon the hyena. He felt no fear, for long familiarity with the dangers of his wild world had so accustomed him to them that he took whatever came as a part of each day's existence, as you accept the homely though no less real dangers of the farm, the range, or the crowded metropolis. Being jungle-bred, he was ready to protect his kill from all comers within ordinary limitations of caution. Under favorable conditions, Tarzan would face even Numa himself, and if forced to seek safety by flight, he could do so without any feeling of shame. There was no braver creature roamed those savage wilds, and at the same time there was none more wise, the two factors that had permitted him to survive. Dango might have charged sooner but for the savage growls of the ape-man, growls which, coming from human lips, raised a question and a fear in the hyena's heart. He had attacked women and children in the native fields, and he had frightened their men about their fires at night, but he never had seen a man-thing who made this sound that reminded him more of Numa angry than of a man afraid. When Tarzan had completed his repast, he was about to rise and hurl a clean-picked bone at the beast before he went his way, leaving the remains of his kill to Dango, but a sudden thought stayed him, and instead he picked up the carcass of the deer, threw it over his shoulder, and set off in the direction of the gulch. For a few yards Dango followed, growling, and then realizing that he was being robbed of even a taste of the luscious flesh, he cast discretion to the winds and charged. Instantly, as though nature had given him eyes in the back of his head, Tarzan sensed the impending danger and, dropping Bara to the ground, turned with raised spear. Far back went the brown right hand and then forward, lightning-like, backed by the power of giant muscles and the weight of his brawn and bone. The spear, released at the right instant, drove straight for Dango, caught him in the neck, where it joined the shoulders and passed through the body. When he had withdrawn the shaft from the hyena, Tarzan shouldered both carcasses and continued on toward the gulch. Below lay Numa beneath the shade of the lone tree, and at the ape-man's call he staggered slowly to his feet. Yet weak as he was, he still growled savagely, even essaying a roar at the sight of his enemy. Tarzan let the two bodies slide over the rim of the cliff. "Eat, Numa," he cried. "It may be that I shall need you again." He saw the lion, quickened to new life at the sight of food, spring upon the body of the deer, and then he left him rending and tearing the flesh as he bolted great pieces into his empty maw. The following day Tarzan came within sight of the German lines. From a wooded spur of the hills he looked down upon the enemy's left flank and beyond to the British lines. His position gave him a bird's-eye view of the field of battle, and his keen eyesight picked out many details that would not have been apparent to a man whose every sense was not trained to the highest point of perfection, as were the ape-man's. He noted machine gun emplacements cunningly hidden from the view of the British and listening posts placed well out in no man's land. As his interested gaze moved hither and thither from one point of interest to another, he heard from a point upon the hillside below him, above the roar of cannon and the crack of rifle fire, a single rifle spit. Immediately his attention was centered upon the spot where he knew a sniper must be hid. Patiently he awaited the next shot that would tell him more surely the exact location of the rifleman, and when it came he moved down the steep hillside with the stealth and quietness of a panther. Apparently he took no cognizance of where he stepped, yet never a loose stone was disturbed nor a twig broken. It was as though his feet saw. Presently, as he passed through a clump of bushes, he came to the edge of a low cliff, and saw upon a ledge some 15 feet below him a German soldier prone behind an embankment of loose rock and leafy boughs that hid him from the view of the British lines. The man must have been an excellent shot, for he was well back of the German lines, firing over the heads of his fellows. His high-powered rifle was equipped with telescope sights, and he also carried binoculars, which he was in the act of using as Tarzan discovered him, either to note the effect of his last shot or to discover a new target. Tarzan let his eye move quickly toward that part of the British line the German seemed to be scanning, his keen sight revealing many excellent targets for a rifle placed so high above the trenches. The Hun, evidently satisfied with his observations, laid aside his binoculars and again took up his rifle, placed its butt in the hollow of his shoulder and took careful aim. At the same instant a brown body sprang outward from the cliff above him. There was no sound, and it is doubtful that the German ever knew what manner of creature it was that alighted heavily upon his back, for at the instant of impact the sinewy fingers of the ape-man circled the hairy throat of the Bosche. There was a moment of futile struggling followed by the sudden realization of dissolution. The sniper was dead. Lying behind the rampart of rocks and boughs, Tarzan looked down upon the scene below. Near at hand were the trenches of the Germans. He could see officers and men moving about in them, and almost in front of him a well-hidden machine gun was traversing no man's land in an oblique direction, striking the British at such an angle as to make it difficult for them to locate it. Tarzan watched, toying idly with the rifle of the dead German. Presently he fell to examining the mechanism of the piece. He glanced again toward the German trenches and changed the adjustment of the sights. Then he placed the rifle to his shoulder and took aim. Tarzan was an excellent shot. With his civilized friends he had hunted big game with the weapons of civilization, and though he never had killed except for food or in self-defense, he had amused himself firing at inanimate targets thrown into the air, and had perfected himself in the use of firearms without realizing that he had done so. Now, indeed, would he hunt big game. A slow smile touched his lips as his finger closed gradually upon the trigger. The rifle spoke, and a German machine gunner collapsed behind his weapon. In 3 minutes Tarzan picked off the crew of that gun. Then he spotted a German officer emerging from a dugout and the 3 men in the bay with him. Tarzan was careful to leave no one in the immediate vicinity to question how Germans could be shot in German trenches when they were entirely concealed from enemy view. Again, adjusting his sights, he took a long-range shot at a distant machine gun crew to his right. With calm deliberation he wiped them out to a man. 2 guns were silenced. He saw men running through the trenches and he picked off several of them. By this time the Germans were aware that something was amiss, that an uncanny sniper had discovered a point of vantage from which this sector of the trenches was plainly visible to him. At first they sought to discover his location in no man's land. But when an officer looking over the parapet through a periscope was struck full in the back of the head with a rifle bullet which passed through his skull and fell to the bottom of the trench, they realized that it was beyond the parados rather than the parapet that they should search. One of the soldiers picked up the bullet that had killed his officer, and then it was that real excitement prevailed in that particular bay, for the bullet was obviously of German make. Hugging the parados, messengers carried the word in both directions, and presently periscopes were leveled above the parados and keen eyes were searching out the traitor. It did not take them long to locate the position of the hidden sniper, and then Tarzan saw a machine gun being trained upon him. Before it had gotten into action, its crew lay dead about it, but there were other men to take their places, reluctantly perhaps, but driven on by their officers they were forced to it, and at the same time 2 other machine guns were swung around toward the ape-man and put into operation. Realizing that the game was about up, Tarzan with a farewell shot laid aside the rifle and melted into the hills behind him. For many minutes he could hear the sputter of machine gun fire concentrated upon the spot he had just quit, and smiled as he contemplated the waste of German ammunition. They have paid heavily for Wasimbu the Waziri, whom they crucified, and for his slain fellows he mused, but for Jane they can never pay, no, not if I killed them all. After dark that night, he circled the flanks of both armies and passed through the British outguards and into the British lines. No man saw him come. No man knew that he was there. The headquarters of the 2nd Rhodesians occupied a sheltered position far enough back of the lines to be comparatively safe from enemy observation. Even lights were permitted, and Colonel Capell sat before a field table on which was spread a military map, talking with several of his officers. A large tree spread above them. A lantern sputtered dimly upon the table, while a small fire burned upon the ground close at hand. The enemy had no planes, and no other observers could have seen the lights from the German lines. The officers were discussing the advantage in numbers possessed by the enemy and the inability of the British to more than hold their present position. They could not advance. Already they had sustained severe losses in every attack, and had always been driven back by overwhelming numbers. There were hidden machine guns, too, that bothered the colonel considerably. It was evidenced by the fact that he often reverted to them during the conversation. "Something silenced them for a while this afternoon," said one of the younger officers. "I was observing at the time and I couldn't make out what the fuss was about, but they seemed to be having a devil of a time in a section of trench on their left. At one time I could have sworn they were attacked in the rear. I reported it to you at the time, sir. You'll recall, for the blighters were peppering away at the side of that bluff behind them. I could see the dirt fly. I don't know what it could have been." There was a slight rustling among the branches of the tree above them, and simultaneously a lithe, brown body dropped in their midst. Hands moved quickly to the butts of pistols, but otherwise there was no movement among the officers. First they looked wonderingly at the almost naked white man standing there with the firelight playing upon rounded muscles, took in the primitive attire and the equally primitive armament, and then all eyes turned toward the colonel. "Who the devil are you, sir?" snapped that officer. "Tarzan of the Apes," replied the newcomer. "Oh, Greystoke," cried a major, and stepped forward with outstretched hand. Preswick acknowledged Tarzan as he took the proffered hand. "I didn't recognize you at first," apologized the major. "The last time I saw you, you were in London in evening dress. Quite a difference, upon my word, man, you'll have to admit it." Tarzan smiled and turned toward the colonel. "I overheard your conversation," he said. "I have just come from behind the German lines. Possibly I can help you." The colonel looked questioningly toward Major Preswick, who quickly rose to the occasion and presented the ape-man to his commanding officer and fellows. Briefly, Tarzan told them what it was that brought him out alone in pursuit of the Germans. "And now you have come to join us?" asked the colonel. Tarzan shook his head. "Not regularly," he replied. "I must fight in my own way, but I can help you. Whenever I wish, I can enter the German lines." Capell smiled and shook his head. "It's not so easy as you think," he said. "I've lost 2 good officers in the last week trying it, and they were experienced men, none better in the intelligence department." "Is it more difficult than entering the British lines?" asked Tarzan. The colonel was about to reply when a new thought appeared to occur to him, and he looked quizzically at the ape-man. "Who brought you here?" he asked. "Who passed you through our outguards?" "I have just come through the German lines in yours and passed through your camp," he replied. "Send word to ascertain if anyone saw me." "But who accompanied you?" insisted Capell. "I came alone," replied Tarzan, and then, drawing himself to his full height, "You men of civilization, when you come into the jungle, are as dead among the quick. Manu, the monkey, is a sage by comparison. I marvel that you exist at all. Only your numbers, your weapons, and your power of reasoning save you. Had I a few hundred great apes with your reasoning power, I could drive the Germans into the ocean as quickly as the remnant of them could reach the coast. Fortunate it is for you that the dumb brutes cannot combine, could they? Africa would remain forever free of men. But come, can I help you? Would you like to know where several machine-gun emplacements are hidden?" The colonel assured him that they would, and a moment later Tarzan had traced upon the map the location of 3 that had been bothering the English. "There is a weak spot here," he said, placing a finger upon the map. "It is held by blacks, but the machine guns out in front are manned by whites. Wait, I have a plan. You can fill that trench with your own men, and enfilade the trenches to its right with their own machine guns." Colonel Capell smiled and shook his head. "It sounds very easy," he said. "It is easy for me," replied the ape-man. "I can empty that section of trench without a shot. I was raised in the jungle. I know the jungle folk, the Gomangani, as well as the others. Look for me again on the 2nd night," and he turned to leave. "Wait," said the colonel. "I will send an officer to pass you through the lines." Tarzan smiled and moved away. As he was leaving the little group about headquarters, he passed a small figure wrapped in an officer's heavy overcoat. The collar was turned up, and the visor of the military cap pulled well down over the eyes, but as the ape-man passed, the light from the fire illuminated the features of the newcomer for an instant, revealing to Tarzan a vaguely familiar face. Some officer he had known in London, doubtless, he surmised, and went his way through the British camp and the British lines, all unknown to the watchful sentinels of the outguard. Nearly all night he moved across Kilimanjaro's foothills, tracking by instinct an unknown way, for he guessed that what he sought would be found on some wooded slope higher up than he had come upon his other recent journeys in this, to him, little-known country. 3 hours before dawn, his keen nostrils apprised him that somewhere in the vicinity he would find what he wanted, and so he climbed into a tall tree and settled himself for a few hours' sleep. Chapter 4. When the lion fed. Kudu, the sun, was well up in the heavens when Tarzan awoke. The ape-man stretched his giant limbs, ran his fingers through his thick hair, and swung lightly down to earth. Immediately he took up the trail he had come in search of, following it by scent down into a deep ravine. Cautiously he went now, for his nose told him that the quarry was close at hand, and presently from an overhanging bough he looked down upon Horta, the boar, and many of his kinsmen. Unslinging his bow and selecting an arrow, Tarzan fitted the shaft and, drawing it far back, took careful aim at the largest of the great pigs. In the ape-man's teeth were other arrows, and no sooner had the first one sped than he had fitted and shot another bolt. Instantly the pigs were in turmoil, not knowing from whence the danger threatened. They stood stupidly at first, and then commenced milling around until 6 of their number lay dead or dying about them. Then with a chorus of grunts and squeals they started off at a wild run, disappearing quickly in the dense underbrush. Tarzan then descended from the tree, dispatched those that were not already dead, and proceeded to skin the carcasses. As he worked, rapidly and with great skill, he neither hummed nor whistled, as does the average man of civilization. It was in numerous little ways such as these that he differed from other men, due probably to his early jungle training. The beasts of the jungle that he had been reared among were playful to maturity, but seldom thereafter. His fellow apes, especially the bulls, became fierce and surly as they grew older. Life was a serious matter during lean seasons. One had to fight to secure one's share of food then, and the habit once formed became lifelong. Hunting for food was the life labor of the jungle bred, and a life labor is a thing not to be approached with levity nor prosecuted lightly. So all work found Tarzan serious, though he still retained what the other beasts lost as they grew older, a sense of humor which he gave play to when the mood suited him. It was a grim humor, and sometimes ghastly, but it satisfied Tarzan. Then, too, were one to sing and whistle while working on the ground, concentration would be impossible. Tarzan possessed the ability to concentrate each of his 5 senses upon its particular business. Now he worked at skinning the 6 pigs, and his eyes and his fingers worked as though there was naught else in all the world than these 6 carcasses, but his ears and his nose were as busily engaged elsewhere, the former ranging the forest all about, and the latter assaying each passing zephyr. It was his nose that first discovered the approach of Saber the lioness, when the wind shifted for a moment. As clearly as though he had seen her with his eyes, Tarzan knew that the lioness had caught the scent of the freshly killed pigs, and immediately had moved downwind in their direction. He knew from the strength of the scent spoor and the rate of the wind about how far away she was, and that she was approaching from behind him. He was finishing the last pig, and he did not hurry. The 5 pelts lay close at hand. He had been careful to keep them thus together, and near him an ample tree waved its low branches above him. He did not even turn his head, for he knew she was not yet in sight, but he bent his ears just a bit more sharply for the first sound of her nearer approach. When the final skin had been removed, he rose. Now he heard Saber in the bushes to his rear, but not yet too close. Leisurely he gathered up the 6 pelts and one of the carcasses, and as the lioness appeared between the boles of 2 trees, he swung upward into the branches above him. Here he hung the hides over a limb, seated himself comfortably upon another with his back against the bole of the tree, cut a hind quarter from the carcass he had carried with him, and proceeded to satisfy his hunger. Saber slunk, growling, from the brush, cast a wary eye upward toward the ape-man, and then fell upon the nearest carcass. Tarzan looked down upon her and grinned, recalling an argument he had once had with a famous big-game hunter who had declared that the king of beasts ate only what he himself had killed. Tarzan knew better, for he had seen Numa and Saber stoop even to carrion. Having filled his belly, the ape-man fell to work upon the hides, all large and strong. First he cut strips from them about 1/2 inch wide. When he had sufficient number of these strips, he sewed 2 of the hides together, afterwards piercing holes every 3 or 4 inches around the edges. Running another strip through these holes gave him a large bag with a drawstring. In similar fashion, he produced 4 other like bags, but smaller, from the 4 remaining hides, and had several strips left over. All this done, he threw a large, juicy fruit at Sabre, cached the remainder of the pig in a crotch of the tree, and swung off toward the southwest through the middle terraces of the forest, carrying his 5 bags with him. Straight he went to the rim of the gulch where he had imprisoned Numa, the lion. Very stealthily he approached the edge and peered over. Numa was not in sight. Tarzan sniffed and listened. He could hear nothing, yet he knew that Numa must be within the cave. He hoped that he slept. Much depended upon Numa not discovering him. Cautiously he lowered himself over the edge of the cliff, and with utter noiselessness commenced the descent toward the bottom of the gulch. He stopped often and turned his keen eyes and ears in the direction of the cave's mouth at the far end of the gulch, some 100 feet away. As he neared the foot of the cliff, his danger increased greatly. If he could reach the bottom and cover half the distance to the tree that stood in the center of the gulch, he would feel comparatively safe, for then, even if Numa appeared, he felt that he could beat him either to the cliff or to the tree. But to scale the first 30 feet of the cliff rapidly enough to elude the leaping beast would require a running start of at least 20 feet, as there were no very good hand or footholds close to the bottom. He had had to run up the first 20 feet like a squirrel running up a tree. That other time he had beaten and infuriated Numa to it. He had no desire to attempt it again unless the conditions were equally favorable, at least, for he had escaped Numa's raking talons by only a matter of inches on the former occasion. At last he stood upon the floor of the gulch. Silent as a disembodied spirit, he advanced toward the tree. He was halfway there and no sign of Numa. He reached the scarred bole from which the famished lion had devoured the bark and even torn pieces of the wood itself, and yet Numa had not appeared. As he drew himself up to the lower branches, he commenced to wonder if Numa were in the cave after all. Could it be possible that he had forced the barrier of rocks with which Tarzan had plugged the other end of the passage where it opened into the outer world of freedom? Or was Numa dead? The ape-man doubted the verity of the latter suggestion, as he had fed the lion the entire carcasses of a deer and a hyena only a few days since. He could not have starved in so short a time, while the little rivulet running across the gulch furnished him with water aplenty. Tarzan started to descend and investigate the cavern when it occurred to him that it would save effort were he to lure Numa out instead. Acting upon the thought, he uttered a low growl. Immediately he was rewarded by the sound of a movement within the cave, and an instant later a wild-eyed, haggard lion rushed forth, ready to face the devil himself were he edible. When Numa saw Tarzan, fat and sleek, perched in the tree, he became suddenly the embodiment of frightful rage. His eyes and his nose told him that this was the creature responsible for his predicament, and also that this creature was good to eat. Frantically the lion sought to scramble up the bole of the tree. Twice he leaped high enough to catch the lowest branches with his paws, but both times he fell backward to the earth. Each time he became more furious. His growls and roars were incessant and horrible, and all the time Tarzan sat grinning down upon him, taunting him in jungle Billingsgate for his inability to reach him, and mentally exulting that always Numa was wasting his already waning strength. Finally the ape-man rose and slung his rope. He arranged the coils carefully in his left hand and the noose in his right, and then he took a position with each foot on one of 2 branches that lay in about the same horizontal plane, and with his back pressed firmly against the stem of the tree. There he stood hurling insults at Numa until the beast was again goaded into leaping upward at him, and as Numa rose the noose dropped quickly over his head and about his neck. A quick movement of Tarzan's rope hand tightened the coil, and when Numa slipped backward to the ground only his hind feet touched, for the ape-man held him swinging by the neck. Moving slowly outward upon the 2 branches, Tarzan swung Numa out so that he could not reach the bole of the tree with his raking talons. Then he made the rope fast after drawing the lion clear of the ground, dropped his 5 pigskin sacks to earth, and leaped down himself. Numa was striking frantically at the grass rope with his 4 claws. At any moment he might sever it, and Tarzan must therefore work rapidly. First he drew the larger bag over Numa's head and secured it about his neck with the drawstring. Then he managed, after considerable effort, during which he barely escaped being torn to ribbons by the mighty talons, to hog-tie Numa, drawing his 4 legs together and securing them in that position with the strips trimmed from the pigskins. By this time the lion's efforts had almost ceased. It was evident that he was being rapidly strangled, and as that did not at all suit the purpose of the Tarmangani, the latter swung again into the tree, unfastened the rope from above and lowered the lion to the ground, where he immediately followed it and loosed the noose about Numa's neck. Then he drew his hunting knife and cut 2 round holes in the front of the head bag opposite the lion's eyes for the double purpose of permitting him to see and giving him sufficient air to breathe. This done, Tarzan busied himself fitting the other bags, one over each of Numa's formidably armed paws. Those on the hind feet he secured not only by tightening the drawstrings but also rigged garters that fastened tightly around the legs above the hocks. He secured the front feet bags in place similarly above the great knees. Now, indeed, was Numa the lion reduced to the harmlessness of Bara, the deer. By now Numa was showing signs of returning life. He gasped for breath and struggled, but the strips of pigskin that held his 4 legs together were numerous and tough. Tarzan watched and was sure that they would hold, yet Numa is mightily muscled, and there was the chance always that he might struggle free of his bonds, after which all would depend upon the efficacy of Tarzan's bags and drawstrings. After Numa had again breathed normally and was able to roar out his protests and his rage, his struggles increased to titanic proportions for a short time, but as a lion's powers of endurance are in no way proportionate to his size and strength, he soon tired and lay quietly. Amid renewed growling and another futile attempt to free himself, Numa was finally forced to submit to the further indignity of having a rope secured about his neck, but this time it was no noose that might tighten and strangle him, but a bowline knot, which does not tighten or slip under strain. The other end of the rope Tarzan fastened to the stem of the tree. Then he quickly cut the bonds securing Numa's legs and leaped aside as the beast sprang to his feet. For a moment the lion stood with legs far outspread, then he raised first one paw and then another, shaking them energetically in an effort to dislodge the strange footgear that Tarzan had fastened upon them. Finally he began to paw at the bag upon his head. The ape-man, standing with ready spear, watched Numa's efforts intently. Would the bag's hold? He sincerely hoped so. Or would all his labor prove fruitless? As the clinging things upon his feet and face resisted his every effort to dislodge them, Numa became frantic. He rolled upon the ground, fighting, biting, scratching and roaring. He leaped to his feet and sprang into the air. He charged Tarzan, only to be brought to a sudden stop as the rope securing him to the tree tautened. Then Tarzan stepped in and rapped him smartly on the head with the shaft of his spear. Numa reared upon his hind feet and struck at the ape-man, and in return received a cuff on one ear that sent him reeling sideways. When he returned to the attack, he was again sent sprawling. After the 4th effort, it appeared to dawn upon the king of beasts that he had met his master. His head and tail dropped, and when Tarzan advanced upon him, he backed away, though still growling. Leaving Numa tied to the tree, Tarzan entered the tunnel and removed the barricade from the opposite end, after which he returned to the gulch and strode straight for the tree. Numa lay in his path, and as Tarzan approached, growled menacingly. The ape-man cuffed him aside and unfastened the rope from the tree. Then ensued a half-hour of stubbornly fought battle while Tarzan endeavored to drive Numa through the tunnel ahead of him, and Numa persistently refused to be driven. At last, however, by dint of the unrestricted use of his spear point, the ape-man succeeded in forcing the lion to move ahead of him and eventually guided him into the passageway. Once inside, the problem became simpler, since Tarzan followed closely in the rear with his sharp spear point, an unremitting incentive to forward movement on the part of the lion. If Numa hesitated, he was prodded. If he backed up, the result was extremely painful, and so, being a wise lion who was learning rapidly, he decided to keep on going, and at the end of the tunnel, emerging into the outer world, he sensed freedom, raised his head and tail, and started off at a run. Tarzan, still on his hands and knees just inside the entrance, was taken unaware with the result that he was sprawled forward upon his face and dragged 100 yards across the rocky ground before Numa was brought to a stand. It was a scratched and angry Tarzan who scrambled to his feet. At first he was tempted to chastise Numa, but as the ape-man seldom permitted his temper to guide him in any direction not countenanced by reason, he quickly abandoned the idea. Having taught Numa the rudiments of being driven, he now urged him forward, and there commenced as strange a journey as the unrecorded history of the jungle contains. The balance of that day was eventful both for Tarzan and for Numa. From open rebellion at first, the lion passed through stages of stubborn resistance and grudging obedience to final surrender. He was a very tired, hungry, and thirsty lion when night overtook them, but there was to be no food for him that day or the next. Tarzan did not dare risk removing the head bag, though he did cut another hole which permitted Numa to quench his thirst shortly after dark. Then he tied him to a tree, sought food for himself, and stretched out among the branches above his captive for a few hours' sleep. Early the following morning they resumed their journey, winding over the low foothills south of Kilimanjaro, toward the east. The beasts of the jungle who saw them took one look and fled. The scent spoor of Numa alone might have been enough to have provoked flight in many of the lesser animals, but the sight of this strange apparition that smelled like a lion, but looked like nothing they ever had seen before, being led through the jungles by a giant Tarmangani, was too much for even the more formidable denizens of the wild. Saber, the lioness, recognizing from a distance the scent of her lord and master intermingled with that of a Tarmangani, and the hide of Horta, the boar, trotted through the aisles of the forest to investigate. Tarzan and Numa heard her coming, for she voiced a plaintive and questioning whine as the baffling mixture of odors aroused her curiosity and her fears, for lions, however terrible they may appear, are often timid animals, and Saber, being of the gentler sex, was naturally, habitually inquisitive as well. Tarzan Yuen slung his spear, for he knew that he might now easily have to fight to retain his prize. Numa halted and turned his outraged head in the direction of the coming she. He voiced a throaty growl that was almost a purr. Tarzan was upon the point of prodding him on again when Saber broke into view, and behind her the ape-man saw that which gave him instant pause: 4 full-grown lions trailing the lioness. To have goaded Numa then into active resistance might have brought the whole herd down upon him, and so Tarzan waited to learn first what their attitude would be. He had no idea of relinquishing his lion without a battle, but knowing lions as he did, he knew that there was no assurance as to just what the newcomers would do. The lioness was young and sleek, and the 4 males were in their prime, as handsome lions as he ever had seen. 3 of the males were scantily men, but one, the foremost, carried a splendid black mane that rippled in the breeze as he trotted majestically forward. The lioness halted 100 feet from Tarzan, while the lions came on past her and stopped a few feet nearer. Their ears were upstanding and their eyes filled with curiosity. Tarzan could not even guess what they might do. The lion at his side faced them fully, standing silent now and watchful. Suddenly the lioness gave vent to another little whine, at which Tarzan's lion voiced a terrific roar and leaped forward straight toward the beast of the black mane. The sight of this awesome creature with the strange face was too much for the lion, toward which he leaped, dragging Tarzan after him, and with a growl the lion turned and fled, followed by his companions and the she. Numa attempted to follow them. Tarzan held him in leash, and when he turned upon him in rage, beat him unmercifully across the head with his spear. Shaking his head and growling, the lion at last moved off again in the direction they had been traveling, but it was an hour before he ceased to sulk. He was very hungry, half famished in fact, and consequently of an ugly temper, yet so thoroughly subdued by Tarzan's heroic methods of lion taming that he was presently pacing along at the ape-man's side like some huge saint. Bernard. It was dark when the two approached the British right. After a slight delay farther back because of a German patrol it had been necessary to elude. A short distance from the British line of outguard sentinels, Tarzan tied Numa to a tree and continued on alone. He evaded a sentinel, past the outguard and support, and by devious ways came again to Colonel Capel's headquarters, where he appeared before the officers gathered there as a disembodied spirit materializing out of thin air. When they saw who it was that came thus unannounced, they smiled, and the colonel scratched his head in perplexity. "Someone should be shot for this," he said. "I might just as well not establish an outpost if a man can filter through whenever he pleases." Tarzan smiled. "Do not blame them," he said, "for I am not a man. I am Tarmangani. Any Mangani who wished to could enter your camp almost at will, but if you have them for sentinels, no one could enter without their knowledge." "What are the Mangani?" asked the colonel. "Perhaps we might enlist a bunch of the beggars." Tarzan shook his head. "They are the great apes," he explained, "my people, but you could not use them. They cannot concentrate long enough upon a single idea. If I told them of this, they would be much interested for a short time. I might even hold the interest of a few long enough to get them here and explain their duties to them. But soon they would lose interest, and when you needed them most, they might be off in the forest searching for beetles instead of watching their posts. They have the minds of little children, that is why they remain what they are." "You call them Mangani and yourself Tarmangani. What is the difference?" asked Major Preswick. "Tar means white," replied Tarzan, "and Mangani, great ape. My name, the name they gave me in the tribe of Kerchak, means white skin. When I was a little balu, my skin, I presume, looked very white indeed against the beautiful black coat of Kala, my foster mother, and so they called me Tarzan." the Tarmangani. They call you too, Tarmangani, he concluded, smiling. Capel smiled. It is no reproach, Greystoke, he said, and by Jove, it would be a mark of distinction if a fellow could act the part. And now, how about your plan? Do you still think you can empty the trench opposite our sector? Is it still held by Gomangani? Asked Tarzan. What are Gomangani? Inquired the colonel. It is still held by native troops, if that is what you mean. Yes, replied the ape-man. The Gomangani are the great black apes, the Negroes.
What do you intend doing and what do you want us to do? Asked Capel.
Tarzan approached the table and placed a finger on the map. Here is a listening post. He said they have a machine gun in it. A tunnel connects it with this trench. At this point his finger moved from place to place on the map as he talked. Give me a bomb, and when you hear it burst in this listening post, let your men start across no man's land slowly. Presently they will hear a commotion in the enemy trench, but they need not hurry, and whatever they do, have them come quietly. You might also warn them that I may be in the trench, and that I do not care to be shot or bayoneted. And that is all? Queried Capel. After directing an officer to give Tarzan a hand grenade, you will empty the trench alone. Not exactly alone, replied Tarzan with a grim smile, but I shall empty it. And by the way, your men may come in through the tunnel from the listening post if you prefer. In about half an hour, Colonel, and he turned and left them. As he passed through the camp, there flashed suddenly upon the screen of recollection, conjured there by some reminder of his previous visit to headquarters, doubtless, the image of the officer he had passed as he quit the colonel that other time, and simultaneously recognition of the face that had been revealed by the light from the fire. He shook his head dubiously. No, it could not be, and yet the features of the young officer were identical with those of Fräulein Kircher, the German spy he had seen at German headquarters the night he took Major Schneider from under the nose of the Hun general and his staff. Beyond the last line of sentinels, Tarzan moved quickly in the direction of Numa, the lion. The beast was lying down as Tarzan approached, but he rose as the ape-man reached his side. A low whine escaped his muzzled lips. Tarzan smiled, for he recognized in the new note almost a supplication. It was more like the whine of a hungry dog begging for food than the voice of the proud king of beasts. Soon you will kill and feed, he murmured in the vernacular of the great apes. He unfastened the rope from about the tree, and with Numa close at his side, slunk into no man's land. There was little rifle fire, and only an occasional shell vouched for the presence of artillery behind the opposing lines. As the shells from both sides were falling well back of the trenches, they constituted no menace to Tarzan, but the noise of them and that of the rifle fire had a marked effect upon Numa, who crouched trembling close to the Tarmangani as though seeking protection. Cautiously the two beasts moved forward toward the listening post of the Germans. In one hand Tarzan carried the bomb the English had given him, in the other was the coiled rope attached to the lion. At last Tarzan could see the position a few yards ahead. His keen eyes picked out the head and shoulders of the sentinel on watch. The ape-man grasped the bomb firmly in his right hand. He measured the distance with his eye and gathered his feet beneath him. Then in a single motion he rose and threw the missile, immediately flattening himself prone upon the ground. 5 seconds later there was a terrific explosion in the center of the listening post. Numa gave a nervous start and attempted to break away, but Tarzan held him and, leaping to his feet, ran forward, dragging Numa after him. At the edge of the post he saw below him but slight evidence that the position had been occupied at all, for only a few shreds of torn flesh remained. About the only thing that had not been demolished was a machine gun which had been protected by sandbags. There was not an instant to lose. Already a relief might be crawling through the communication tunnel, for it must have been evident to the sentinels in the Hun trenches that the listening post had been demolished. Numa hesitated to follow Tarzan into the excavation, but the ape-man, who was in no mood to temporize, jerked him roughly to the bottom. Before them lay the mouth of the tunnel that led back from no man's land to the German trenches. Tarzan pushed Numa forward until his head was almost in the aperture. Then, as though it were an afterthought, he turned quickly and, taking the machine gun from the parapet, placed it in the bottom of the hole close at hand, after which he turned again to Numa, and with his knife quickly cut the garters that held the bags upon his front paws. Before the lion could know that a part of his formidable armament was again released for action, Tarzan had cut the rope from his neck and the head bag from his face, and grabbing the lion from the rear had thrust him partially into the mouth of the tunnel. Then Numa balked, only to feel the sharp prick of Tarzan's knife point in his hindquarters. Goading him on, the ape-man finally succeeded in getting the lion sufficiently far into the tunnel so that there was no chance of his escaping other than by going forward or deliberately backing into the sharp blade at his rear. Then Tarzan cut the bags from the great hind feet, placed his shoulder and his knife point against Numa's seat, dug his toes into the loose earth that had been broken up by the explosion of the bomb, and shoved. Inch by inch at first Numa advanced. He was growling now, and presently he commenced to roar. Suddenly he leaped forward, and Tarzan knew that he had caught the scent of meat ahead. Dragging the machine gun beside him, the ape-man followed quickly after the lion, whose roars he could plainly hear ahead mingled with the unmistakable screams of frightened men. Once again a grim smile touched the lips of this man-beast. "They murdered my Waziri," he muttered. "They crucified Wasimbu, son of Muviro." When Tarzan reached the trench and emerged into it, there was no one in sight in that particular bay, nor in the next, nor the next, nor the next, as he hurried forward in the direction of the German center. But in the fourth bay he saw a dozen men jammed in the angle of the traverse at the end, while leaping upon them and rending with talons and fangs was Numa, a terrific incarnation of ferocity and ravenous hunger. Whatever held the men at last gave way as they fought madly with one another in their efforts to escape this dread creature that from their infancy had filled them with terror, and again they were retreating. Some clambered over the parados and some even over the parapet, preferring the dangers of no man's land to this other soul-searing menace. As the British advanced slowly toward the German trenches, they first met terrified blacks who ran into their arms, only too willing to surrender. That pandemonium had broken loose in the Hun trench was apparent to the Rhodesians not only from the appearance of the deserters, but from the sounds of screaming, cursing men which came clearly to their ears. But there was one that baffled them, for it resembled nothing more closely than the infuriated growling of an angry lion. And when at last they reached the trench, those farthest on the left of the advancing Britishers heard a machine gun sputter suddenly before them and saw a huge lion leap over the German parados with the body of a screaming Hun soldier between his jaws and vanish into the shadows of the night. While squatting upon a traverse to their left was Tarzan of the Apes, with a machine gun before him with which he was raking the length of the German trenches. The foremost Rhodesians saw something else. They saw a huge German officer emerge from a dugout just in rear of the ape-man. They saw him snatch up a discarded rifle with bayonet fixed and creep upon the apparently unconscious Tarzan. They ran forward, shouting warnings, but above the pandemonium of the trenches and the machine gun their voices could not reach him. The German leaped upon the parapet behind him, the fat hands raised, the rifle butt aloft for the cowardly downward thrust into the naked back, and then, as moves Era, the lightning moved Tarzan of the Apes. It was no man who leaped forward upon that Boche officer, striking aside the sharp bayonet as one might strike aside a straw in a baby's hand. It was a wild beast, and the roar of a wild beast was upon those savage lips. For as that strange sense that Tarzan owned in common with the other jungle-bred creatures of his wild domain warned him of the presence behind him, and he had whirled to meet the attack. His eyes had seen the corps and regimental insignia upon the other's blouse. It was the same as that worn by the murderers of his wife and his people, by the despoilers of his home and his happiness. It was a wild beast whose teeth fastened upon the shoulder of the Hun. It was a wild beast whose talons sought that fat neck. And then the boys of the 2nd Rhodesian Regiment saw that which will live forever in their memories. They saw the giant ape-man pick the heavy German from the ground and shake him as a terrier might shake a rat, as Saber the lioness sometimes shakes her prey. They saw the eyes of the Hun bulge in horror as he vainly struck with his futile hands against the massive chest and head of his assailant. They saw Tarzan suddenly spin the man about and, placing a knee in the middle of his back and an arm about his neck, bend his shoulders slowly backward. The German's knees gave and he sank upon them, but still that irresistible force bent him further and further and further. He screamed in agony for a moment, then something snapped and Tarzan cast him aside, a limp and lifeless thing. The Rhodesians started forward, a cheer upon their lips, a cheer that never was uttered, a cheer that froze in their throats, for at that moment Tarzan placed a foot upon the carcass of his kill, and raising his face to the heavens, gave voice to the weird and terrifying victory cry of the bull ape. Under-Lieutenant von Goss was dead. Without a backward glance at the awe-struck soldiers, Tarzan leaped the trench and was gone.